All right, well, we got 49 people in the room so far. So let's get started. We may add some folks as we go along. But my name is Paul Wolf. I'm the president of the New York Coalition for Open Government. And we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that focuses on government transparency. And you can learn more about our group at our website, which is nyopenGov.org. I'll say it one more time, nyopenGov.org. So today's presentation is on the Freedom of Information Law. We have two speakers, Kristin O'Neill from the New York State Committee on Open Government, and Steve Brown, who's a reporter from Channel 2 News in Buffalo, New York. And we're gonna have Kristin start by talking about 20 minutes or so about the Freedom of Information Law statute, and then we'll open it up to some questions, which you could either submit in the chat box or raise your hand. And then after Kristin and some questions for her, we'll have Steve Brown speak and then take questions from him as well. So we kind of broke it up into two parts. One is we have a lot of government officials here, a lot of clerks, town clerks, city clerks. So Kristin kind of going over what's required by the statute, which is good for government folks to know and for the citizens to know who are submitting FOILs. And then Steve kind of talking about his experience in filing FOILs and the delays you experience and how you deal with some of those things. So we're trying to give information that is good for everyone that's on this today. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Kristin.
So my name is Kristin O'Neill. I'm the Assistant Director of the New York State Committee on Open Government. The Committee on Open Government was created by statute by the Freedom of Information Law in 1974. At that time, it was called the Committee on Access to Public Records. I think it changed at some point in the early 80s to the Committee on Open Government, in part because in addition to having advisory oversight over the Freedom of Information Law, we also it's our role to provide advice and guidance regarding the New York State Open Meetings Law. We're administratively housed within the New York State Department of State. We are a government agency. I like to refer to us as quasi-independent. I work for the Department of State, and that they have administrative oversight over our office, but we are given a certain level of independence to act, which is important because we need to be able to give advice that we believe is consistent with the statute, consistent with case law, without needing necessarily approval of people higher up, either within the Department of State or within the executive chamber. It should be independent, and we've been lucky enough to be able to maintain that level of independence, so we appreciate that. So what we do is we are available to all members of the public. Anyone can contact our office with open government questions about the Freedom of Information Law, the Open Meetings Law. To a lesser extent, we don't get as many questions about the Personal Privacy Protection Law, but that is also within our advisory jurisdiction. But that only governs records maintained by state agencies under the auspices of the governor's executive chamber. But there are the three statutes that we have advisory jurisdiction over. Any member of the public can call our office, can email our office, can request advisory opinions. You can be a government employee, you can be a member of the media, or you can just be a regular citizen with questions about open government. That's what we do. Our information is available on our website. An easy way to find our website is to Google our acronym COOG, C-O-O-G. So if you can't remember that, we're housed on the Department of State website, which is dos.ny.gov. You can find us by going to the Department of State website. We're listed under their committees and commissions, or you can just Google COOG and you'll probably find it that way. The New York State Freedom of Information Law is codified in the New York Public Officers Law. It's Public Officers Law, Article 6. So if you want to actually look at the statute, that's where it is. Luckily, the statute, we make it easy to find for you. It's on our website. The Committee on Open Government's website is, again, housed on the Department of State website if you're looking for it. And we try to provide information that we believe will be helpful to the public if they want to, if they have questions and think that maybe it's such an easy question that it's not necessary to call us. There's a good chance that they can find answers to their questions on our website. We have copies of the statute. We, both the Freedom of Information Law, the Open Meetings Law, and of course the Personal Privacy Protection Law. We have frequently asked questions regarding those statutes. We have advisory opinions, legal advisory opinions regarding the statutes and questions relating to those statutes. They're indexed alphabetically by keyword. So for the advisory opinion, you're going to see an alphabetical index. If you're looking for questions about time limits, you can click on RT and you'll scroll down and you'll see a section relating to time limits. If you have questions about Meetings Law and executive session, you can go to the Open Meetings Law advisory opinions, click on the letter E, scroll down, you'll see there's a series of advisory opinions that way. They're also searchable by keywords. So if you're not sure you can't find a keyword that works for you, you can also just search the advisory opinions by keyword. So overall, the Freedom of Information Law was originally acted in 1974. It had a fairly limited scope and most people were not particularly thrilled with that version. So it was repealed and replaced with the current version in 1978. And that version is based on what we call a presumption of access. So very often I get questions from government agencies, from the public. Is this record subject to FOIL? And my answer to that is all records are subject, all government records are subject to FOIL. The question is whether there's any ground for denial set forth in the statute that would allow you to deny it in whole or in part. If there's no ground for denial, then it's a record subject to FOIL and subject to FOIL disclosure. It's a presumption of access. Who's covered by FOIL? FOIL governs access to agency records, and the term agency is defined as any state or municipal department, board, bureau, division, commission, committee, public authority, public corporation, council, office, or other governmental entity performing a governmental or proprietary function for the state or any one or more municipalities thereof. I know that's a lot. And you can think agencies are state agencies under the governor's executive chamber. They are counties, cities, towns, villages, school districts, fire districts, public library units of local government across the state of New York. Sometimes questions about why the Committee on Open Government doesn't have enforcement authority, and that's part of the answer. We're a staff of 3. It's myself, our executive director, and our wonderful administrative assistant, and we're just staff enough to be able to have enforcement authority. If that ever changes, they're going to need to increase our staff tenfold because we just, it would just too much for the staffing level. So
you're very low.
The entities that are not subject to FOIL, or at least not considered agencies, are the judiciary. So the courts records maintained by the courts are not subject to the Freedom of Information Law. That doesn't necessarily mean that the court records are not accessible. It just means they're accessible under other statutes. Other statutes govern access to court records. The state legislature is not considered an agency, as that term is defined by the Freedom of Information Law. The Freedom of Information Law does include a provision relating to access to state legislative records, but it's very limited. It includes just a list of the records that you may access, that the public has access to, as opposed to all other government agencies where the rule is the presumption of access. If the records that you're looking for from the state legislature are not on that list, regrettably, you're likely going to be out of luck. You're not going to be able to get access to those records. The term record is defined very broadly under the Freedom of Information Law. Any information kept, held, filed, produced, or reproduced by, with, or for an agency in any physical form whatsoever. So it's a very, very broad definition. It's much broader, for example, than the definition of record established by the New York State Archives. New York State Archives focuses, which the New York State Archives, for those that don't know, established the record retention and disposition schedules for government agencies. It establishes the schedule for what records every government agency is obligated to maintain and for how long they must maintain them and when they're permitted to destroy them. But that definition is much more limited than the definition of record under the Freedom of Information Law. So under FOIL, you can any record that that government agency maintains, regardless of whether they were required to create it or maintain it in the first place. They may have created it and maintained it voluntarily, and it's not subject to a retention and disposition schedule. Doesn't mean it's not subject to FOIL. Its definition of a record is very, very broad. It's going to include paper sitting on your desk. It's going to include data in your database. It's going to include video and audio, any information in any physical form whatsoever. The term Freedom of Information Law is a bit of a misnomer because it's actually, the FOIL is an access to records statute. You're not required to, an agency is not required to provide information that does not exist in record form in response to an inquiry, for example. If someone emails a government agency and says, can you explain to me why you made this decision? Well, yeah, that's a request for information, but it's not a request for records, so it's not a FOIL request. An agency is not required to create records in response to type up a list. They're not required to manually create a new Excel database that would require someone to manually enter information into that database. But it does not mean that you're not required to extract data from a database. When I say you don't have to create a record, people should keep in mind that the data in a database is the record. Pulling it out and putting it in a format that allows the public to access it, to be able to read it, is just making a copy of that data. It's not creating a new record. Also, making a copy of a record and converting it to a preferred format is not creating a new record. For example, if someone asks you to scan a record and email it to them, if an agency receives a request that says, please, I don't want photocopies, I would prefer that if you have it in electronic format, please just attach it to an email and send it to me. If you don't have an electronic format and you have the ability to do so, please scan that PDF or whatever version is created and attach it to an email and send it to me. That's not creating a new record. That's just making a copy. That is something an agency is obligated to do. There's 3 exceptions to the rule that you're not required to create a record. Every agency is required to maintain and make available to the public 3 things, 3 categories. 1 is a record of how every member of a public body votes. You would think this would be included in the open meetings law, but I think because this predates the open meetings law, it's an obligation that still is maintained under the Freedom of Information Law. So this is an addition to the minutes requirements under the open meetings law, which does not actually state the open meetings law doesn't say that you have to have a record of how each member votes. The Freedom of Information law does. You're also required, every agency is required to maintain a list of the name, public office, address, title, and salary of all of its employees and officials. And the last thing that every agency is required to maintain is a reasonably detailed subject matter list. And you recall earlier in our conversation, I mentioned the record and retention and disposition schedules. Many units of local government adopt that record retention and disposition schedule as their subject matter list. And in our opinion, it's a great idea, perfectly permissible and acceptable to us. Let's see. I want to make sure I cover important things. Paul, if you think I might be skimming over something that you think is important, I'll try to move through here. But feel free to remind me. The people who make the FOIL requests, the members of the public who are making FOIL requests, they have fairly minimal obligations on their part. One of the obligations is that they are required to put their request in writing and direct it to the agency's records access officer. Every agency is required to have a record access officer whose responsibility it is to coordinate the agency's response, to the point person for the agency. Depending on the size of the agency, you may have more than one records access officer. Most units of local government generally just have one, like small units. For example, at the town level, I would say 99% of town government, their records access officers, their clerk, which makes sense because the town clerk is the records. Similar, the village level village clerks are often, or maybe a village manager serves as the records access officer. But that information should be available to the public if it's not on your website, which ideally I think it should be. It make life easier for the public if they can go on your website and very easily figure out how to make a FOIL request. That would be great. The person making the request has an obligation to reasonably describe the records that they're seeking. They need to be able to give enough detail so that the agency that is receiving the record doesn't have to struggle too much to figure out what is being requested. Another aspect of this obligation to reasonably describe records is the agency, if the agency cannot locate the records with reasonable effort, a request can be denied on that basis. And a little background here, this depends on, and this is based on pretty old Court of Appeals case law, it depends on the agency's record keep system. Of course, as we've moved towards more electronic records, being able to search for records and search for records in different ways has become easier and easier. But if you're talking about paper records, for example, if you have a filing cabinet full of perhaps property records, you have a filing cabinet, and those records are perhaps either maintained, they're searchable by property ad or by person's name, by property owner's name. Maybe those are the two ways that a municipality has a way for searching those records. If someone makes a FOIL request for copies of building permit applications for property owners that wanted to add an addition to their home, that may not be, if the records are just maintained in paper form and there's a searchable electronic database that would allow an agency to pull up those particular permits, an agency could deny that request on the ground that they do not maintain their records in a manner that would allow them to locate the records with reasonable effort. Let's see, let's see, we talked about the records access officer. Every agency has to designate at least one person as records access officer by name or by specific job title. Time limits. Every FOIL request must something must happen within the first 5 business days of an agency receiving a FOIL request. The agency has to either provide the records sought, deny access to the records sought, state they don't have the records, or if it's a larger FOIL request and the agency needs more time, they must acknowledge the request and give a date by which they plan to respond. Generally, that date should not be more than 20 business days. If it's going to be longer than 20 business days, the agency has an obligation to provide a date certain that is reasonable under the circumstances. It's always been the Committee on Open Government's position that the law does not permit repeated extensions. I will note, however, that the courts have not necessarily agreed with the Committee on Open Government, and repeated extensions have not been shot down by the courts, which is a bit of a frustration from part of the public. It's a bit of a frustration on our part at the Committee on Open Government. We believe if an agency needs more than 20 business days, they should assess at point how long it's going to take and give a date certain by which they plan to respond. Even if that date is 6 months from now or a year from now, if it's reasonable, it's reasonable, but the public should have a clear expectation of when going to get those records, or when they're going to get a response, and not keep getting bumped out month after month. The time limit for responding to a FOIL appeal is 10 business days. Every agency at this point, what the statute said, if it's able, it must accept requests by email. Imagine that there's any agency anywhere in the state of New York that does not have the ability to accept FOIL requests via email. Agencies cannot require a requester to use its form. You can have a form. There's nothing wrong with providing a form and making that available to the public for ease of use, but you cannot require the public to use their form. You can require that they put their request in writing, but you cannot require that they use your form. Appeals, there are 2 ways of a denial of access. One is what I call an affirmative or an express denial of access. Agency responds to the request and says, yes, we have record that you're asking for, but we're going to deny it in whole or in part. Here's the reason why we're denying it in whole or in part. Here's the right to file an administrative appeal, and here's who that should be directed. Action by an agency that gives right to file an administrative appeal, that gives rise to the right to file an administrative appeal, is what we refer to as a constructive denial of access. It's when the agency fails to respond to the request within the time limit set forth in the statute. So if you submit a FOIL request and 5 business days goes by and the agency has failed to even acknowledge your request, that's a constructive denial of access. If the agency acknowledges your request and says, we'll get back to you within 20 business days, and the 20 business days comes and goes, and they have failed to respond, that's a constructive denial of access. We have model language on our website for appealing those types of denials. So if that happens to you and you're looking for some model language for how to appeal that type of denial, it's available on our website. We certainly don't really have time to go into all the detailed permissible grounds for denial, but the overall overriding theme of the grounds that are set forth in the Freedom of Information Law is that some type of perhaps harm, about actual harm, or perhaps it's harm to a commercial entity, where they disclosure of, for example, trade secrets, or disclosure of contract bids before the contract is awarded, personal privacy, law enforcement, the types of things where if the information was disclosed, something bad could happen. That's the overriding theme of the grounds for denial. As I mentioned, if there is a denial of access, the person who's been denied access has the right to file an appeal. And that's whether the record has been denied in its entirety or whether it's just been denied in part. Even if there's just 1 or 2 redactions on a page, that's a denial of access. And the person who made the request, the agencies will explain what the basis of the denial is, and the person makes the request has to file an administrative appeal within 30 calendar days. The FOIL appeals officer, who is either the head or governing body of the agency, or more frequently the person or persons designated by the head or governing body. FOIL appeals officer cannot be the same as the records access officer, and within 10 business days, the FOIL appeals officer must either provide the records sought or fully explain reasons for further denial. Copies of the appeals and the appeal determinations are supposed to be provided to our office. That can be done by mail or by email. Email is perfectly acceptable. And I know I've used up more than my time than I was supposed to, so I'm going to let everybody know that I will be doing continuing training. This is something that I've been wanting to do for a while, but the COVID situation has prompted me to be more proactive about this. Every month I'm going to be doing some sort of open government training. This month, next week, I'm doing a program on the open meetings law. Last month, I did a program on the freedom of information law. Next month, I will also be doing a program on the freedom of information law. So keep an eye on our website for those dates, and we can go into more detail. And that's way more than my time than I was supposed to take. Sorry, Paul.
Well, thank you, Kristin. Your connection, it says your bandwidth is low, so it was a little choppy at times, but I think.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I think we got most of it, but I will open it up to any questions. So if people can either submit it through the chat box or raise your hand if you know how to do that. Since we have 52 people on here, I just don't want people to start talking all at once. So does anybody have any questions? I don't see any indication of people raising their hand. So perhaps if someone wants to unmute themselves, if you have a question.
Yes, Paul, I have a question. You mentioned that it's an acceptable, under certain circumstances, agencies can take additional time to provide the information. We have a situation in our municipality where all requests are delayed. We're immediately informed that it will be at least a month. And typically it is much longer than that. And the reason they give is that, and all the requests here have to go through the city law department. They claim that they are understaffed and they simply don't have time to respond immediately. So is that an acceptable reason?
Really, the only time that they're required to give a reason for the delay is if they're taking longer than 20 business days post acknowledgement. In my opinion, if it's a simple request and the record is clearly public and readily available, there's generally no reason for that delay. But what we also need to keep in mind is that one person's request is often one of many. And that, we are working under difficult times right now where not everybody is working in offices, they're telecommuting. So there's a couple of different things. Certainly, I think if someone makes a FOIL request, goes to their town government or city council and says, could I get a copy of the meeting minutes from last month's city council meeting, having to wait over a month for a response to that, in my opinion, does not seem reasonable. However, the statute really only says that they need to give a date for they need to give a reason for delay if they're going to take longer than 20 business days.
Because sometimes it is so long that by the time you get the information, it's no longer of value to you. The moment has passed.
Understood.
All right, let me
Thank
go to Jane Curtis, who has a question.
That was me that just spoke.
Oh, okay, sorry. I know Steve Brown just submitted a question through chat as far as the current executive order by the governor.
There's no executive order in place relating to FOIL. There is one relating to the open meetings law, and that was just recently extended through January 29th, but there's no executive order relating to FOIL.
And then I don't know if you can see the questions in the chat box, Kristin. There's some questions there.
Let's see, for police records, are only arrest records able to be FOILed, or can complaint records? This goes back to my original statement, is presumption of access. People can ask for anything that they want. They can ask for any record that you maintain. And if you want to deny access, if you believe that there would be harm caused by disclosure, you need to look at the statutory grounds for denial and see whether any portion of that record fits within that denial. With incident reports, sometimes there's very intimate personal details contained in incident reports. Maybe it's a domestic incident where nobody was arrested. The police were called and they showed up because neighbors heard yelling. It turns out, yes, they were yelling at each other, but there was no physical problem. No one was hurt, and everybody's embarrassed, and they promised to behave going forward. Well, maybe disclosure of the details of that incident report would constitute an unwarranted invasion of personal privacy because there was no criminal activity involved. So again, it's a presumption of access. If you're going to deny access to a record, you need to be able to rely on one of the permissible grounds for denial.
Barbara Crozier, did you have a question?
Yes, I did.
Can't hear you.
I live in the town of Burns.
Still can't hear you. You got to turn your volume up.
Let me access it from my.
Well, we're going to have to move on because we can't hear you.
Maybe if you want to type it in, Barbara.
William James had a question, but doesn't know how to raise his hand. So William, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, I'm unmuted.
Okay. Go
Is
ahead.
that the same as raising my hand?
No, but go ahead.
No, I just was wondering. You asked that before, to raise hand.
Right.
Thank you. Over and out.
What's your question, William?
I think it was answered
Oh, okay.
since I typed that.
All right. Anyone else have a question before we go on to Mr. Brown? All right, Steve, why don't we turn it over to you?
Okay, I'm going to try and get through the things that I have come to learn over many years submitting FOIL requests. And I really appreciate, Kristin being here and running through the law so that there's at least a base understanding, because the number one rule for me is you have to know the rules. They will be your guideposts as to how to submit a request. And I'm going to talk a little bit about language in a request here in a bit, but submitting a FOIL and how to, maintain your observation of it. In part because, and to the government officials that are here participating in this, good for you, because you're here to learn more about it, and good. But I will tell you that often, not every time, but often, individual agencies or even entire governments are unfamiliar with how FOIL actually works. It's either because they don't deal with it very often, or they just haven't brought themselves up to that learning point. And I'll give you an example. Very first project that I did when I got to Channel 2 7 years ago was to find out about the football helmets that the high school football teams were using. You know, what brand were they? Because there were grades on these items now about being more protective and less protective. So we wanted to find out what the inventory was. And school districts, just generally speaking, didn't have a whole lot of experience in it. So I had to kind of walk them through times every school district in Western New York. So it's not unusual that an agency does not know. So you need to know if you're going to be successful with these things. And the first question you should ask, and Kristin referenced it, is who the FOIL officer is, because that's going to be your point of contact. And I would not suggest you just send it to the head of the agency or the executive branch member or the elected official in the office, because there's a specific person that's going to be tackling that, and you need to make sure that that gets into their hands. And please do your homework before submitting a FOIL. Kristin again references. You have to know what the record's name is and be able to identify it. It makes it easier for them to find. And otherwise, as Kristin pointed out, you can be functionally denied, because if you can't figure out what it is, then they'll never be able to comply with what it is that you're looking for. You need to be exceptionally well organized. I don't even know how many FOILs out right now, but I do have timetables on all of them. I do have reminders set up in my calendar to check in, to remind them that, hi, a due date is coming up. I'm going to be looking for these records. Your time is almost up. When can I have them? Can I have them now? But you're going to have to be really organized with these, because sometimes government agencies, particularly those that are thin staffed, aren't necessarily keeping up on top of this request that you have as well as you might. So keeping them mindful of it and of the deadlines is, I think, part of a formula that I found that keeps producing results in terms of getting the paperwork, getting the information that you're looking for. In terms of language, and I learned this at a conference. There's a gentleman who teaches at University of Arizona, that is probably the most learned person I've ever run into about freedom of information laws, state by state and federal. And he suggests this, and he's actually tested it, and he says there are great results with it, and I've gotten some better responses too. Please remember that this is a law, that there is a presumption that you're going to get access to these documents. So you're not requesting anything, you're placing an order. And respectfully, they're McDonald's, they're expected to deliver the order. So don't use request. It's not a request. I am placing an order for documents. So that I think the language change is very important, because it changes it from may I have it to this is what I am looking to get my hands on. And this is an order. It's the same as any other operation where you want something and you place an order. And I would strongly suggest that. And when you submit your order, I've done this, and it's a good reminder to include a portion of the statute which includes the penalties or remedies for failing to comply. And that's usually right at the bottom. And I usually put it in italics to make sure that they see it, because there are penalties and there are remedies. And you want to make sure that they understand that you're serious about this, and that, again, they may not be familiar with the law, because in my experience, there have been plenty of government agencies, offices, and entire governments that just aren't. So you need to make sure that they understand that, quite frankly, there's going to be some consequence here if you don't. There are a couple of tricks to this, to getting things moved along. And I really appreciate Kristin's answer on the executive orders from the governor. I appreciate that COVID has changed everything, particularly on the state government level. But there is, and I will share with you this, there's a state government agency, and I'm essentially looking for purchase orders for a particular project. And I filed that in February of last year. I have gotten a series of, well, because of COVID, blah, blah, blah. And we'll get you an update in a month. Well, in September, they gave me a spreadsheet of the different pieces of information that were on the invoices for this particular project, but they weren't the invoices. So I appealed saying, hi, while the spreadsheet is nice, it's not what I asked for. I asked for the purchase orders, the invoices for this particular project. And there is evidence that the invoices exist because you created the spreadsheet from the information that had to come from those purchase orders. So I want them. And my appeal was accepted, which surprised me, without any debate. And we're still functionally trying to get this stuff from this particular state agency. In my experience, state agencies, particularly state government agencies, and I want to make sure Kristin knows that I'm not talking about her office, have been particularly prickly about producing information. It is my experience of 37 years of doing this. It is as state governments go, the most difficult to pry out information from. It's been exceptionally difficult. And we're, in terms of the example that I just told you, we're in the process of going to court to, have an Article 78 hearing and ask a judge to demand that they produce the documents that we've been waiting for almost a year now. So that's the other thing I need to warn you about, is that if a government agency or entity decides that we're gonna just be difficult with this and obstinate and not necessarily follow the law and give you a bunch of excuses, you got to be willing to, to go the extra mile sometimes with these agencies that are being that, if you will, stubborn. And I appreciate that, going to court costs money, attorneys cost money. And I'm in a good place because I work for a corporation that really is aggressive about reporting and journalism and has attorneys. So we can go in and pursue these things when we need to. So it's a very real threat when we tell them, hi, we've done this before and we'll do it again, because they know that you mean business, right? I appreciate that individual citizens may not have access to those kinds of resources, but unfortunately that's dealing with sometimes state government. The one trick that I will tell you about that I found, which is really interesting. When you've got a FOIL that's kind of bogged down in process, my suggestion would be that you file a subsequent FOIL asking for all communication related to the previous FOIL. Essentially, emails, notes, memos about this. Because that way you can find out what it is they're saying about your request and about you. And sometimes it's not very flattering. And sometimes when they realize that they've got to produce it, all of a sudden the previous FOIL suddenly gets out of the logjam. And they'll ask follow-up questions like, do you really want this now that you have the other one? And you can decide whether or not you want it or don't want it. You are entitled to it, by the way. But it's just a way to let them know that not only are you going to be stubborn enough to prevail on getting the original documentation, that there may be also, in my case, stories about how it is you were discussing this particular request from a citizen of your government. So it's just a little game that you can play with them to let them know that you're watching them and that they're being held to the highest standard of this particular law. And Paul, because we're kind of low on time, I'm going to wrap it up there.
Okay, anybody have any questions of Mr. Brown?
Hi, it's Barbara Crozier. Sorry, I'm having computer issues. But first of all, I live in the town of Bern, and I want to thank you for the report you did on our dysfunctional town government. And my question, I think actually Mr. Brown pretty much answered, but it was about, the question was, when you provide or you make a FOIL request and then they provide you in their response, it's information that maybe is tangentially related to your request, but is not at all fulfilling your request. So I guess Mr. Brown answered that question. So thank you.
Yeah, if they give you the wrong thing, then remind them that they're being non-responsive and, appeal immediately.
Great. I also like the idea of as spoiling their correspondence and anything related to your FOIL request. I like that a lot.
I just want to stick my nose in on that point a little bit. I just don't want people to get their hopes up too much on that point, because internal correspondence among government employees most often can be withheld as under the interagency material exception. So where you've got government agency employees emailing, sharing advice, opinions, recommendations, anything that reflects a deliberative process is going to be able to get withheld under the Freedom of Information Law. It's not to say everything will get withheld. There may be information you might be able to get, but I just don't want people to get their hopes up too high on that point.
Any other questions?
Yes,
I have a
I have one.
Go ahead, Maria.
Okay, I have a question. Mr. Brown, thank you so much for being on, having this opportunity to even ask questions. I have a question because you're such an expert on these FOILs. What do you do when, after you go through the tedium of getting a request, a FOIL, then, you know, you finally get sort of an answer, the pandemic, whatever, and then you finally get this record that everything is redacted to the point where it really doesn't make any sense. So if I ask for a list of names, just for example, 15 names, and you gave me 15 names, and you blacked out all the names and the dates and the subject, how do you circumvent that obstacle?
Was it, going back to Kristin's point, were they names that should have been in the public, like it's a police record or it's a voter registration record, you know, stuff that's public, they have to produce. So is it something that, generally speaking, is thought of as public information?
Yes, I can tell you specifically. It's a list of people who have paid money for some pumps. They receive $1,500. Sometimes they give it back to people, sometimes they don't. It's supposed to be for sellers, but sometimes they get it from the buyer. And my question was, where is this money? What are you doing with it? And how much have you collected? And what they've said is, we can't give Mr. Steve Brown's name because it's a secret and it would invade his privacy. So I have to respond to this shortly. And so if you have given money to the public, isn't that a public record? And how would I be invading your privacy by knowing that you gave a check to $1,500 when you were doing a real estate transaction?
Yeah, if a government agency gave, in my opinion, and Kristin's more of an expert, but if a government agency gave somebody money, yeah, that's a record. That's, I mean,
No, they took money. They took money, and they don't always give it. Yeah, they don't always give it back.
The funds that they collect would seem to be a public record to me. I don't know.
I mean,
why.
did you say it had to do with sump pumps?
Yeah, they just take money and then there's a collection. My question was like, what are you doing with this money once you keep it? They're supposed to give it back to you in 90 days, but they don't always. And so they said, well, it just goes in the general fund. And so the general fund, I don't know if that goes to Albany or do they keep it? And no one seems to know where this money is or how they do this. And they said no one's ever asked this question before. And this law has been around since 1988, but it's just money is just being collected, and like you could sell your mother's house and they say, okay, it's $1,500 to do this transaction. You say, okay, and you go on your merry way. Nobody seems to know where the money is. And I think they're very legitimate. Where the money is, how much, how it's collected, or what it's used for.
I can follow up with you about that, Maria, afterwards.
Okay, thank you.
I'm just gonna like really quickly say, also keep in mind, going back to my presentation, is that FOIL is going to be about access to records, not about answering questions. So you want to be, if you're looking for this type of information, you need to try to think about what records an agency, a town government, or a municipality is going to be maintaining that's going to contain the information that you're seeking. So instead of submitting a FOIL request that asks questions, you want to submit a FOIL request that asks for records. In my opinion, records reflecting money that's changing hands relating to sump pumps would not constitute an unwarranted invasion of personal privacy. It's not a particularly intimate detail about people's lives. The courts have held, like, for example, water bills. I pay I pay a water bill, water and sewer bill to the town of Bethlehem. How much water and sewer usage I have is a public record. If someone wanted to make a FOIL request for my water and sewer bill, they could, even though, as a private citizen, regardless of whether I'm a public employee or not. It's just not a personal or intimate detail. And it's not one of those situations where, in my view, disclosure would constitute an unwarranted invasion of personal privacy.
Thank you so much.
Jane Curtis, you have a question.
Yes, as you have pointed out, most of us don't have the resources to file an Article 78. So could you elaborate a bit more about the formal appeals process and how we go about it?
Yeah, I mean,
Go ahead.
briefly, my experience is that either the FOIL officer or there's a separate appeals officer that handles it if it's a big agency, and you simply write a letter and the reasons why it is that you think that either they should have given you the records, they gave you the wrong records, or what have you. But it's another one of those key questions that you have to ask. Is there a separate appeals officer for the FOIL? And they should identify this particularly if they deny your record, they should identify who it is your appeal should go to.
They're required by our regulations if they issue an affirmative denial of access, whether it's withholding a record in its entirety or redacting a record, they're supposed to give you a reason for the denial, and they're supposed to tell you how to file an appeal, to whom that appeal should be directed. And the FOIL appeal officer, pursuant to our regulations, cannot be the same person as the records access officer.
Great, thank you.
Dominique Calhoun, you have a question. Dominique, you got to unmute yourself if you have a question. All right, anybody else?
Hey, Mark Jaggard had a question, Paul, that he put into the chat, and I just would like to expound on it a little bit. There are some key dates. They're required by an agency is required by the law to respond in some form within 5 days. So, when would he's asking, when should I remind them? Well, at day 4, remind them, hi, tomorrow, there's a response that's required. And I would suggest that you get ahead of them to make sure that they know. And it's completely fine to say, am I going to get a response tomorrow? Just to, push them along a little bit. But that's just a technique that I've used to make sure that they know I haven't forgotten about this and that there's an important due date coming up.
I'm going to, to each their own, but just because I have sympathy for records access officers and the amount of communications that they need to deal with, I'm going to recommend not doing that. Just give them their time. If the 5 business days comes and goes, then give them a little bit of a heads up. Maybe not jump straight to the appeal. Maybe just say, hey, I was supposed to get a response yesterday and I didn't. When you have somebody like a town clerk who's got dozens of different responsibilities, and FOIL is one of them and a very important one, sending those repeated emails, sort of reminding them, oh, you've got something to do tomorrow. Okay, I know I've got something to do tomorrow, but I've got something to do today too. Just try to be respectful of the fact that you've got government employees that have many responsibilities, and generally FOIL is just one of them. So I just want people to keep that in mind and remember that government employees, I know we all get a bad rap. Sometimes it's justifiable, but I'm going to say to a large percentage of the time, we're all just trying to do a good job and trying to do the right thing.
I will also add that sometimes, I'm very thankful that we have a FOIL law in New York State. I wish it was stronger because I think it's weaker than others. Florida would be a great example. But this is a process with deadlines in it. Sometimes it is much better to be able to talk to them about what it is that you need, because a government agency isn't required to give you something only when a FOIL comes in. They certainly could do this outside of that. It's a formal process and a law that they have to build. But if you have a relationship or work on building relationships, particularly with agencies that you're going to again and again and again and again, then the process becomes easier to get that stuff, even if it is, and I've had this multiple times, where I've talked to somebody from an agency who says, I can get you that, but just please submit a FOIL so that I can have it. And it's a relationship that you can work on. The law is there to ensure that you get access, but it's not the only way that you can get access to these. And sometimes it's just used as a backstop for some employee at an agency who may have to answer the question, well, why did you give them that information? Well, they submitted a FOIL, and it kind of gives them an out. So the relationships are really, in my view, relationships are really important in getting information promptly. I've had one example, a local police agency that I was asking for pretty sensitive information that I didn't know I would, how long it would take. And I was just asked, submit a FOIL. I got it an hour later. And it was a pretty substantial spreadsheet that they just copied off and emailed me. So they're, building a relationship with, particularly if you're frequent flyers of asking for information from, that's really important in my view. The law is great, but having a relationship where they know you, familiar with you, comfortable with you, that can shortcut a lot of things.
Kristin, there's a question in the chat that maybe you could answer, that there's a board member in a town who's frequently told that he has to submit FOIL requests for information he's seeking. And I don't know if you're a town board member, or if there's a difference as far as obtaining information, or if that's a common practice.
It often, unfortunately, comes down to sort of politics. No, individual town board members have no additional rights to records than any other member of the public. If you collectively, as a body, want records, you pass a resolution requiring, certain records to be provided to the town board for review on an ongoing basis, something of that nature. But sorry, my dog's barking. Somebody's at the front door. Individual board members do not have any additional rights to records than any other. And sometimes, I encourage, if the request for records is being made because the board member needs those records in order to perform their functions. Oh, sorry, really barking now. As a courtesy, they should be being provided, but from a statutory basis, can the town clerk or whoever is in charge require that they submit a FOIL request? Yes, they can.
All right, Dominique Calhoun, I know you tried to ask a question earlier. Go ahead.
Thanks so much. Sorry, my phone had died. Okay, I just want a little clarity of the invasion of privacy definition. So if you have a person who was involved in an incident and they have an internal affairs investigation, and that person, the investigation is complete, that person who was involved is requesting the information, so they don't feel that their privacy is being invaded. Could that refer to the officer's invasion of privacy when he was acting as a government official? Like he was doing, so whose invasion of privacy are we talking about when they can deny the request for records?
Usually it's the people named in the report, not the police officers.
Okay. And I have one more question as well. This pertains to requesting the way that public officials vote. So could you just put in a general request, let's just say for the past year of 2020, I just would like to know the way a certain public official voted without the complete minutes of all of the meetings. And then they can send you, like, if the subject matter was, animal shelter killings of that. Do you agree or not? And then it says yes or no. Can you just get basic information like that, or would it have to be the complete minutes of the meetings?
It depends on how an agency maintains its records. Honestly, the likelihood is that most municipalities do not maintain their records in a way that would allow them to give it to you in the way that you're suggesting. The most likely scenario is that the information that you're seeking is contained in each individual set of meeting minutes, and you would have to look through all the minutes.
Okay, thank you, Kristin.
You're welcome.
All right, one last question. I see Evelyn Feld. I can't see what your full last name has a question. You're on mute. You got to unmute yourself.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for this training. I wondered if there is any simple informational pamphlet-like summary introductions to this thing, because to get started, some of our public don't even know that they can ask for information.
Yep, we have a great pamphlet right on our website. It's called Your Right to Know. So if you go to the Committee on Open Government's website, under the heading of publications, you'll see a link to something called Your Right to Know. It's HTML, but also you can click on a PDF version if you'd like to, print it out and make a pamphlet out of it. It has a nice, simple overview of both the Freedom of Information Law and the Open Meetings Law.
Great, perfect, thanks.
You're welcome.
All right, well, I'm going to wrap it up here, and I thank everyone for participating. We had some great questions and great information. And so check out Kristin is going to be doing more of these trainings. The Coalition for Open Government will also be doing some more in the future. So hope to work together with you all next time. So thanks, everybody, and we're going to end it there.